Big tech headed to Capitol Hill next week. Julia Borson's in Los Angeles with the details. Hi, Julia.
Melissa, the Senate Intelligence Committee in a hearing on Wednesday morning will press Facebook's CEO Sheryl Sandberg and Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey on social media companies' responses to foreign influence operations. Facebook says we can expect Sandberg to focus on the platform taking accountability and responsibility around preventing election interference, detailing Facebook's investment in a combination of technological improvements and new hires to shut down fake accounts responsible for the interference, and Facebook's collaboration, including with government agencies, companies, and a range of experts. And while the Senate Intelligence Committee invited Alphabet CEO Larry Page, as of now, he's not scheduled to testify. The committee rejected Google's offer to send SVP Kent Walker to testify. Now, the hearing comes on the heels of a range of attacks on Google and its peers. Senator Hatch asking the FTC to re-examine Google's potentially anti-competitive conduct. And earlier this week, President Trump tweeted that Google's search is biased against conservatives. He said in an interview with Bloomberg that the influence of the likes of Amazon, Facebook, and Google is a, quote, very antitrust situation. Now, in the afternoon on Wednesday, Jack Dorsey will head over to the other side of the Hill for a grilling before the House Energy and Commerce Committee on how the company monitors content and blocks certain users. They'll talk, I'm sure, about whether or not that approach is biased. Now, Melissa, remember when Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress back in April and there were some awkward exchanges that revealed that some of the senators were not so familiar with Facebook's business model? This time around, I'd expect them to have done a little bit more homework. Back over to you.
I will hope so, Julia, although if there is a question about, well, Google won't be there, so they can't discuss the algorithm, because that would have really revealed whether or not they did their homework. Do you think that that even though the hearings are really meant to focus on ads and whether or not the platforms are being used surreptitiously to influence campaigns, that other topics will creep in?
I'm sure other topics will creep in, but I think it's important to know that these are two totally different hearings. The first one really is about election interference, whether or not there should be concerns ahead of the midterms, whether or not these companies have really done everything they possibly can to make sure there is no manipulation around the midterms and other elections. And then the other question is, in terms of what's going to happen in the afternoon over at the House, that's really, I think, about censorship and bias. And I think that's where we'll really get the questions about whether or not there is an inherent bias either to the algorithms or to the people who work at these companies. So it'll be interesting to see how they go. And then, of course, who knows, anything could be asked.
Julia, thank you. Julia Borson in Los Angeles. Well, Twitter, Facebook, and Alphabet all lower today. So are investors getting nervous? Should they be nervous? I mean, do you remember the exchange that one congressperson had with Mark Zuckerberg when they said, how do you operate a business where you don't charge the users? And Zuckerberg said, well, we sell ads. There was a complete lack of understanding of what the business model was.
So the politicians went to school on it, but I do believe that the corporations went to school on that as well. So I think that you're going to see a lot of it. And their stock prices were already affected ahead of this. So you've seen Twitter demolished, Google not demolished, Amazon not demolished, but Amazon's a different beast. We're not talking about that. Facebook flat. All of these names have already taken on the chin. They've already got the cerebral content that they need in front of these politicians. So I think the worst is over, quite frankly.
Worst is over?
Not for Google. Sorry, let me just preface that. Not for Google.
I mean, we'll take a look at basically Facebook's multiple here, which is exceptionally cheap. If we're going to, we could talk about GAAP versus non-GAAP. I know you want to do that, but obviously, if we're just taking a look at what their forward earnings are, the way they report them right now, relative to their growth rate, the company does look cheap, which suggests that a lot of the bad news is already baked in. Twitter and Alphabet, I don't think, have the same kind of exposure that Facebook does. And it's no surprise to me that folks on the Hill didn't really understand how these businesses work. They don't understand the nuances of a lot of industries.
We run ads, Senator. That's what he said. We run ads, Senator.
We run ads.
So here's the thing about Facebook. It's been de-risked. I mean, they guided the street lower.
But
the estimates
Twitter
have come
and Google,
down.
have they been de-risked?
Twitter could have a whole host of problems, and they don't have the financial flexibility.
The censorship issue is one that has not been addressed in front of the
well, listen,
Hill.
I think the Google thing, it got hit today. It was down 2% at one point. I have to assume that, probably down on a lot of volume. It had something to do with the rhetoric this week. But I think you go back 20 years and you think about when the government set their sights on Microsoft, what that meant. And it wasn't political back then. So I think Google could could really be faced with this sort of stuff, just as Amazon could, just as Facebook could. These guys are talking about self-regulating. At some point, if they don't do a good job self-regulating, there will be regulation. They are just too big, these companies with too much influence.
There can only be self-regulation if there is faith, if there's public faith in these corporations. And it feels like the tables have turned a little bit in terms of whether or not the public in general has full faith in these companies to police themselves.
I don't know. See, I would say the worst isn't over for Facebook.
Yeah.
I'd sort of take the other side. I mean, you look at Facebook, they reported earnings, stock went down 23% in about 10 minutes. We were sitting here when it happened. It went down to 170-ish. Had a bounce over the next couple of days. Guess what? We're pretty much right back down to the levels we saw after earnings. And that's been on what's been a pretty decent broader market tape. So I would suggest, I think we're probably headed back to levels that we last saw when Mr. Zuckerberg made that comment that Dan just said, 155 or so, because I do think Facebook has existential risk that I don't necessarily think Google or Twitter has.
Is it because we don't know the extent of the accounts they need to shut down or the activity that's going on their platforms? I mean, just because they shut down 600 Iranian, whatever they did most recently, we don't know if that's 80% of the activity or 10% of the activity.
Listen, I've said this before, and I'm going to be really quick here. I think Twitter has real problems with fakes, okay? 2 months ago, they told us that they were suspending 70 million accounts to check on the behavior. All you got to do is look at President Trump's Twitter follow count. It hasn't budged. So you're telling me that they suspended 70 million accounts. We all saw our Twitter followers go down during that period, and he just keeps net gaining. That's not happening.
Yeah, I think
no way that's happening.
The only issue is that Twitter will have an answer for it. So they could say that they've done this or they've done that, where Facebook wasn't ready for those questions. So I think he was a little, and he's awkward to begin with. So I think you're going to have a different experience with a Twitter event. As far as Facebook's made a series of higher lows. So I think you might be surprised. It's trapped underneath its moving averages, but you might be pleasantly surprised if you're a long holder. I mean, yes, it could go either way, but it seems as though it's front loaded and coiled to spring actually on these events, not sell off.